All right, so welcome back. We are on day 2 of this project, or at least we should be. Hopefully on day 1 you were able to do a little bit of implied texture practice. We were hoping to get 8 of those. And hopefully you were also able to draw and maybe even practice some color and texture. Hopefully you were able to draw a final draft. Okay, so now that I have done that pre-work and I've done it to an acceptable quality level, now I'm ready to get a piece of paper for my final draft. So as you're starting to see, your paper or your desk is really starting to get filled up with stuff. So here's what I would do. I would just get this practice out of the way, off to the side, okay? Then what I would do is I would fold down my rough draft so that I'm only looking at the one that I intend to do. You might remember from the last video, I said that this is the one that I intend to do for my project. So I'm just going to have that kind of in the area there so that I can look at it, and I'm going to get my final draft out there and ready to go. Okay, now the first thing I should put on there, as always, is my name. So I'm going to write my name, Mr. A, and then I'll turn that over. So a couple things to think about as we're making our final draft. It is always okay to make changes when you're going from rough draft to final draft. Artists change their mind. Sometimes when you're going from a smaller space to a bigger space, you find that things fit in the space differently. So you always have my permission to make subtle changes, and I might make some slight changes to mine. But I'm basically going to draw this the same way that I drew my rough draft. So I'll start with a horizon line, get some mountains in there. Okay. So I always recommend starting with that horizon line. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to do a time lapse on the video so that you can see what my final draft might look like when it's finished being drawn in pencil. Okay, so I feel pretty good about that drawing there. I basically kept my rough draft and my final draft very similar. One small change is I repositioned the sun. You'll notice I had that kind of tucking back behind there, and I kind of liked positioning it right in between the two, so that was a slight change I made. And I decided to add a slight wave to the sun rays, so that's kind of what I mean. I slightly changed the shape of the body of water here, so it's normal and expected that you would make some slight changes as you do this. One thing you'll notice is I did not put any of the implied textures on this yet, and I really want to emphasize that. Do not put any implied textures on this yet. So all those really cool textures that you planned, okay, keep them in the back of your mind. We will be using them, but for this pencil stage, we're not putting them on yet, okay? At this point, we are going to pause the video so that students can work on their final draft with pencil. Once you've gotten this far, then I'd like you to check in with your teacher to make sure that you did your final draft to the best of your abilities. It should look like a better version of your rough draft. And then your teacher will give you permission to use a Sharpie to trace every single pencil line that's here. And this is part of the reason why I don't want you to put any of the implied texture lines on it, because we will be adding those with some colorful Sharpies later. So right now I just have a black Sharpie, and I'm going to go over any pencil line that I put on there, with the exception of, and I always have to say this, do not Sharpie that name on the back, because that can bleed through and then it'll show up on the front. But anything that's on the front, we're going to Sharpie. So here I go. At this point, we will pause the video so that students can work on their black Sharpie step. Okay, once you've got everything traced in with that black Sharpie, I think it's a good idea to just go ahead and erase any pencil lines that are still poking through. So, you know, if you accidentally missed some of your lines a little bit, that's not that big of a deal, because you can easily just erase right over the top of everything and just pull away some of those pencil lines to give your project as clean of a look as possible. Also, I should mention, while you're working, if that Sharpie dries out, just leave it at your table and help yourself to a second or a third. Sometimes when a Sharpie dries out, it doesn't mean it's done for good. It just simply means that it needs a little bit of time to recharge. So just leave it at your table and go get a second or a third Sharpie if you need it. So now that I'm this far, now it's time to start thinking about what types of implied textures I want to put on here. And you really have two resources at this point. You have that rough draft you did yesterday, and of course you also have that sheet of textures that you experimented with and practiced with yesterday as well. So that is the last step here, and I'm going to show you that in a time lapse as well. Okay, so I feel pretty good about where my final draft is at this point. You can see I made some slight changes, right, to texture and color and whatnot. I decided that since I have a big kind of sunset happening here, or maybe it's a sunrise, I wanted my water to reflect the same type of color and a similar pattern to the sun. So that was my decision to go with a warm color instead of a cool color for the water. And just a reminder too, you don't have to be limited by what seems realistic. Obviously I went with some sort of crazy patterns in the mountains on mine. So if this, one other thing I should point out is I intentionally left the sky blank. It's okay to leave some spots blank. I left the sky and the mountaintops, right? But if you look at yours and yours has more blank spots than patterned spots, you need to adjust. You should definitely have more patterns than empty spots. So I have two things that I left blank, the sky and the mountaintops, and obviously I've added patterns to way more than two things. This is probably as far as most students will get on day 2. In fact, I'd be surprised if people finished, but some people will. At this point, we will pause the video so that students can work on their colorful Sharpie step. I'm going to show you another step that could potentially be a bonus step for today, but will definitely be a step that we do on our day 3 of this project. So that will involve some watercolor paint, and I'm going to get those set up and ready for me to go right now. Okay, so when you're ready for painting, you'll need your own set of paints, you'll need a cup of water and a brush, and then of course your project. So these paints, watercolor paints, they work best when they are wet. I'm going to start with that big lake that I have right here. The very first time you use a color, I would add a little extra water to it just to get started. So I actually put 3 dips of water in there. You should never feel like you have to dig into the dry paint. It should just be nice and wet, and you're just taking the water that sits on top of it. Okay, and I'll start to fill that in. Now, of course, watercolor paints are not going to be as opaque or as solid as a regular paint. They're meant to be kind of transparent and see-through, which is why they work, I think, in my opinion, well for this project, because we can work the paint with the Sharpie marker that we have there. If for some reason you paint a little bit outside of your lines, you could always get a paper towel and try to wipe as much of it away as possible. Here, I'll show you what I mean. If I wipe that out of the lines, let me quick run and get a paper towel. Oh, I made a mistake. Let me get a paper towel. So you can blot that away while it's still wet, and some of the color will remain, but that will make it a lot easier for you to paint over it later. I do not allow students to mix colors in the tray. So anytime you change colors, you give your brush a bath in the cup, and then you take a brand new color. However, it is totally fine to mix colors on the paper. Okay, so I know red and orange are next to each other on the color wheel, so I know that those colors will mix really nicely. So I can do a little bit of mixing right on my paper. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of painting here. Oops, see, I got some outside of my lines there because I'm going too fast. Okay, I'm going to do a little painting here on time lapse. All right, so as I'm finishing up here, just a couple of things I want to point out. I hope you noticed that I was giving my brush a bath in between colors. Even if you are only mixing colors on the paper, you still need to give your brush a bath between colors because you want to keep your paint tray clean. Now, one thing I want to point out here is you can see that my paint is very dark here and it's very light here. Watercolor paints are designed to look more like this. They should look see-through. If it's really dark, that means that you don't have enough water there. Or another way to think of it is you have an opportunity to spread that paint around without having to dig into your tray. I think I can probably finish this off with only the paint that's already on my piece of paper. And I'm going to simply do that by pushing around these puddles of paint that are here. Getting a little bit of mixing there, but it actually looks kind of cool, so I'm going to just keep it. I'm using kind of a medium-sized brush for this. If you have really detailed areas, you might need to get a smaller brush. I don't think a large brush is necessary for this project. As long as you're using enough water, I think you'll find that the paint spreads pretty easily. So again, I'm just going to go back to where these puddles are. I'm just trying to push it around. If you work the paper too much, it'll start to rip. So that's what I want to be careful about. And of course, if you have some puddles that are really bothering you, one thing you can do is just take a clean paper towel and just try to lift some of that extra water out, or you could try to just be patient and wait for it to dry. Okay, so there I feel like I have a finished work of art. Here, let me get all the other stuff out of the way so you can see it. I would probably let that sit at my table for a little bit before I move it, because one thing about watercolor projects is if you try to move them when they're too wet, the paint can run and spill on you. So I'd recommend letting that sit and dry for about 5 minutes before you do anything else with it, if you're able to. If you have to move it because I'm making you clean up or something like that, then what you want to do is just grip it by the sides and try to hold it as flat as possible, just like how you would hold a lunch tray. Okay. Thank you for following along with me, and I can't wait to see what your projects look like when they're all done.